Right now, somewhere in the world, a family is making decisions that affect billions of people. You don't know their names. You've never seen their faces on television. But they control the banks. They control the money. They control what happens next in your life, and you have no idea who they are. What if I told you that the richest families in history aren't the ones you think? What if the people running the world are so hidden, so secret, that even world leaders answer to them? Today, we're uncovering 3 shocking truths. First, how one family built an empire that spans every continent. Second, the hidden methods they use to stay invisible. And third, the real reason they've kept this secret for over 200 years. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history that nobody talks about. Let me show you exactly how this happened, and why the most powerful people on Earth work so hard to keep it hidden. The story begins in a small town in Europe, more than 2 centuries ago. A man named Mayor Amschel made a simple choice. He decided to lend money to kings. Not just any money. He lent them the funds they needed to fight wars, to build empires, to control nations. Kings needed money fast. They couldn't wait. They had wars to win tomorrow. Mayor understood something crucial that most people missed. When you control the money, you control the power. When a king needs you, he listens to you. He does what you ask. Mayor wasn't the richest man in the world. He was smarter than that. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want statues built in his honor. He wanted something better. He wanted real power. The kind of power that works quietly. The kind that nobody sees. He had 5 sons. This was his genius move. He sent each son to a different country. One went to London. One went to Paris. One went to Vienna. One went to Naples. One stayed in Frankfurt. Suddenly, this family controlled banking in 5 major European nations simultaneously. When a king in England needed money, he went to one son. When a king in France needed weapons paid for, he went to another. The family communicated through secret channels. They coordinated. They controlled interest rates. They decided which nations would have money and which would struggle. They decided which wars would happen and which would be prevented. Here's the part that shocked historians. These 5 brothers made more money from war than from peace. When nations fought, they needed massive loans. The family lent the money. Then the other side needed money too. The family lent to them as well. Both sides went to war using family money. When it ended, both sides owed the family enormous debts. This wasn't accidental. This was calculated strategy. Over decades, this family expanded. They didn't buy factories like other rich people. They didn't build railroads themselves. Instead, they lent money to people who built factories and railroads. Those people had to pay them back with interest. The family owned the debt. They owned the power behind the power. By the 1800s, this family was involved in virtually every major financial decision in Europe. They weren't the kings. They were something more dangerous. They were the ones the kings owed money to. And when you owe someone money, you do what they want. The family made a critical decision. Stay hidden. Don't run for political office. Don't become famous. Fame brings enemies. Fame brings investigation. Instead, send your children to the best schools. Teach them languages. Teach them finance. Teach them to be invisible. Teach them to see the whole world as a chessboard. They intermarried with other powerful families. They formed alliances. They created a network so complex that tracing it became nearly impossible. They influenced newspapers, so their names rarely appeared in the news. They donated to charities, so people spoke well of them, but never too loudly. By the early 1900s, this family had their fingers in central banks across the globe. They influenced currency values. They controlled interest rates. When they decided money should become scarce, economies crashed. When they decided money should flow freely, economies boomed. They weren't just wealthy. They controlled the rules of wealth itself. What makes this even more remarkable is how few people knew it was happening. Most historians didn't even connect the dots until centuries later. The family had succeeded in becoming so powerful that their power was almost invisible. You couldn't see them because you weren't looking for them. Nobody taught you to look for them. The most brilliant part of their strategy was this. They made the world believe that other people were in control. Presidents seemed important. Prime ministers seemed powerful. But look closely at the decisions these leaders made, and you'll notice something strange. They all followed the same financial logic. They all protected banking interests. They all made choices that benefited the same invisible network. The family had learned the ultimate secret of power. Real power doesn't need a crown. Real power works in the shadows, moving pieces on a board that most people don't even know exists. Now, as this family grew more powerful, they faced a new challenge. How do you stay hidden when you're this influential? The answer was surprisingly simple. You create complexity. The family established themselves in so many different places, in so many different industries, that following their influence became like trying to trace a single thread through an endless tapestry. They owned banks, yes, but they also owned newspapers. They owned shipping companies. They owned land. They owned art. They owned governments, at least financially. When a nation went to war, guess who financed both sides? When a revolution happened, guess who financed both the revolutionaries and the government fighting them? The family didn't care who won. They made money either way. They had engineered a system where they always profited, no matter what happened in the world. This is when things became truly dark. The family discovered that the best way to control people is to control their money. If you control someone's money, you control their choices. You control where they work. You control what they buy. You control who they vote for. Money is freedom, and the family owned the freedom. By the early 1900s, the family's reach extended to America. They established themselves in New York. They created a central banking system. According to historical records, this family and their allies were instrumental in shaping how America's monetary system worked. They convinced lawmakers that a central bank was necessary. They convinced them that this bank should be privately owned, not government-controlled. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, private family had the power to control a nation's entire money supply. They could raise interest rates and crash the economy. They could lower interest rates and create booms. They could literally decide which Americans would be rich and which would be poor. And here's what makes this so remarkable. Most Americans never knew it happened. The family made sure of it. They created layers of institutions, boards of directors, and complex financial instruments that hid their influence. You could study economics in a top university and never hear their name mentioned. The family members married into political families. Suddenly, their relatives were senators and congressmen. Their relatives advised presidents. Their relatives controlled military budgets. But because they shared different last names, the connections stayed hidden. It looked like coincidence. It was actually calculation. During wars, the family's strategy became even more apparent. World War I cost nations trillions of dollars. Where did that money come from? Banks. Who owned the banks? The family. They financed the war. Both sides went into debt to the family. After the war, entire nations were essentially owned by them, bound by debt they could never repay. The same pattern repeated. World War II happened. Again, the family financed both sides. Billions of dollars flowed. Millions of people died. And through it all, one family kept getting richer, kept getting more powerful, kept becoming more invisible. They discovered that the best investments weren't in products. The best investments were in human nature. Fear, greed, ambition, these were reliable. Fund a politician's campaign, and he becomes your ally. Create an economic crisis, and desperate people accept control they wouldn't normally accept. Start a war, and governments spend money on weapons. Enriching industries, the family invested inches. By the middle of the 21st century, this family and their network had achieved something remarkable. They had created a system where their power seemed normal, natural, inevitable. People believed in the system so completely that they defended it. They fought to protect the very system that kept them in chains. The family didn't need to conquer the world anymore. The world was already theirs. They just needed to maintain the illusion that someone else was in control. But here's where the story gets interesting. Even the most hidden things eventually leave traces. And once you know where to look, you can find them. Researchers, historians, and investigators started connecting the dots. They found records. They found old letters. They found financial documents that revealed the network. What emerged was a picture so complex, so intricate, that it seemed almost impossible to believe one family could orchestrate it. The family's method was simple but brilliant. They never appeared publicly as owners. Instead, they used trustees, representatives, and shell companies. Company A was owned by Trust B, which was controlled by Foundation C, which answered to an unknown board in another country. By the time you traced the ownership backwards, you had traveled through so many layers that you forgot where you started. But some researchers didn't give up. They traced the threads anyway. And what they found was shocking. The same names kept appearing. Different countries, different industries, different time periods, but the same families. Always the same families. The family had also mastered public relations. When negative stories emerged, they bought newspapers to bury the stories. When documentaries tried to expose them, they funded competing documentaries that told a different narrative. They didn't need to silence everyone. They just needed to create doubt. If people weren't sure what was true, they would believe whatever seemed most convenient. This is where it gets really interesting. The family discovered something profound about human psychology. People don't want to believe that powerful hidden forces control their lives. It makes them feel powerless. So when the family's influence became visible, most people rejected it. They said it was impossible. They said it was a conspiracy theory. They said the people explaining it were crazy. The family loved this. They had created a situation where the truth sounded like madness, and madness sounded like truth. Around the year 2000, the internet changed things. Information spread faster. People could communicate globally. The family couldn't control all the information anymore. But they adapted. They created fake information too. They flooded the internet with so many conflicting stories that people didn't know what to believe. They called this information warfare, and they were extremely good at it. Yet despite all this, the evidence kept building. Documents leaked. Whistleblowers came forward. Researchers published findings. Slowly, the picture became clearer. The family hadn't conquered the world with weapons. They had conquered it with money. And money, as it turns out, was far more effective than weapons could ever be. The family's power extended into every major institution. They had influence in governments, in education, in media, in healthcare, in technology. When you looked at major decisions being made around the world, you could often trace the influence back to the same network. It was like watching a puppet show, except the puppets didn't know they were puppets. But here's the truly fascinating part. Not all members of the family agreed with this system. Throughout history, some family members rebelled. Some wrote books exposing the truth. Some gave interviews. Some dedicated their lives to dismantling the very system their family created. These rebels were often dismissed or silenced, but their work mattered. They proved that breaking free was possible. By the mid-21st century, the world was changing. Cryptocurrency created money that didn't require banks. Technology allowed people to bypass traditional financial systems. The family's monopoly on power was starting to crack. They could adapt, or they could fail. The question was no longer whether this family controlled finance. Evidence made that clear. The question was what would happen next. Would the world remain enslaved to this system? Or would enough people wake up to change the rules? The family didn't panic when their power started to crack. Panic is for people who don't have options. Instead, they adapted. They had survived centuries of change. They would survive this too. They invested heavily in technology. They bought cryptocurrency companies. They positioned themselves at the forefront of the digital revolution. If the future didn't require traditional banks, then they would own the new systems too. They were always several steps ahead. They also invested in something else: prophecy. By this, I mean they created think tanks and research centers where their people studied future trends. They asked the question everyone wanted answered: what comes next? They didn't wait to see the future. They helped create it. Then they positioned themselves to profit from it. The family understood something crucial that most people missed. Power isn't about controlling a specific thing. Power is about controlling the transition between things. When the world moved from agriculture to industry, they profited. When it moved from industry to technology, they profited. When it moved from national economies to global economies, they profited. Whatever came next, they would be there, ready to profit. This is when people started asking deeper questions. If this family was so powerful, why couldn't they prevent bad things from happening? Why didn't they prevent wars? Why didn't they prevent poverty? Why didn't they prevent suffering? The answer, according to researchers who studied the family's behavior, was disturbing. Bad things made them money. Wars made them money. Poverty made them money. Suffering made them money. The family had no incentive to make the world better. They had every incentive to keep problems alive. In fact, some researchers suggested something even darker. Maybe the family created some of the problems. Maybe they started wars, or funded them, specifically to profit from the chaos. Maybe they maintained poverty, because desperate people are easier to control. Maybe they allowed pandemics to happen, because pandemics create opportunities for those who control medicine and money. This sounds like conspiracy theory, and that's exactly what the family wanted people to think. By making the truth sound absurd, they protected themselves. But here's what's important to understand. Even if only half of what researchers alleged was true, it would still mean that a single family had more power over world events than most governments. It would still mean that your life, your country, your future were being shaped by decisions made in boardrooms you would never enter, by people whose names you would never know. By the 21st century, the family's network had grown to include thousands of people. They intermarried with other powerful families. They created secret societies. They established universities where their principles were taught. They funded politicians all over the world. They owned media companies that shaped what billions of people believed. The most brilliant part of their strategy was this: they made the system seem inevitable. People believed that this is how the world had to work. Governments had to go into debt. Banks had to control money. The rich had to get richer. The poor had to get poorer. It seemed like natural law, like gravity. People fought against it the way they fought against the weather they got frustrated, but they accepted it as inevitable. Yet there was something else happening too. A counter-movement was growing. People were starting to ask questions. They were researching. They were reading the leaked documents. They were connecting the dots. They were starting to understand how the system actually worked. And more importantly, they were starting to realize something powerful. The family's power only worked if people accepted it. The moment enough people said no, the system would collapse. The family knew this. This is why they spent so much effort controlling what people believed. This is why they invested in media and education. They needed people to accept the system. The real power, it turned out, was never held by the family. The real power was held by the billions of people who accepted their rule. And if those people ever decided to reject it, the whole system would crumble. So here we are, at the moment of decision. Everything the family built is being questioned. Their power is becoming visible. And for the first time in centuries, alternatives are emerging. Cryptocurrency promised money without banks. It promised that regular people could control their own finances. It promised liberation from the family's control. But as time went on, it became clear that cryptocurrency had its own problems. It was unstable. It was used for crime. It concentrated power in different hands, sometimes the family's own hands, sometimes in the hands of new tech billionaires. The family watched this carefully. They didn't fight cryptocurrency. They co-opted it. They bought it. They invested in it. Soon, they were positioned to profit from whatever monetary future emerged. But something else was happening too. Young people were waking up. They were learning history. They were understanding how they had been controlled. They were starting to build alternatives. Some started community banks. Some started cooperative ownership models. Some started systems of mutual aid where money wasn't even necessary. The family's greatest weakness had always been complacency. They had become so certain of their power that they thought it was unshakable. But power, throughout history, has always been shakeable. Empires that seemed permanent collapsed. Systems that seemed eternal transformed. Change is the only constant. By the mid-21st century, the question wasn't whether the family would remain powerful forever. The question was how they would evolve, and what would replace them. Would a new family take control? Would power be distributed among many smaller players? Would technology enable genuine equality? Here's what's important to understand about this entire story. The family that controlled global finance wasn't evil in the comic book sense. They were rational actors operating within a system they had created. They followed logical incentives. If you created a system where money creates power, and power creates money, then whoever controlled money would naturally accumulate more power. It wasn't personal. It was mathematical. The solution wasn't to hate the family. The solution was to change the system so that one family couldn't accumulate such power. It was to create systems where money and power were distributed. It was to create transparency so that hidden influence became visible. This is where young people came inches. They weren't going to fight the family. They were going to build something different. They were going to create technologies and systems that made the family's old methods obsolete. They were going to make centralized control unnecessary. The most interesting part is that nobody knows if they'll succeed. History hasn't been written yet. The future is still being decided. Right now, in this moment, both futures are possible. A future where new family of tech billionaires recreates the same pattern of control. Or a future where power is genuinely distributed among billions of people, each with some say in how the world works. What we do know is this: the age of complete invisibility is over. The family's power is visible now. And when power becomes visible, people can choose to accept it or reject it. That choice is everything. The story of this family isn't a story about villains. It's a story about systems. It's about how money works. It's about how power accumulates. It's about human nature itself. And it's a story that isn't finished yet. The ending is being written right now, by all of us, through the choices we make every single day. Here's the truth nobody wants to admit. This family didn't conquer the world. We allowed them to. By accepting their money system, by trusting their banks, by believing their narrative. We gave them power. And that means something incredible. If we stop accepting it, the power disappears. Throughout history, hidden systems have only remained hidden because people didn't look. The moment we started looking, the moment we started asking questions, everything changed. The invisible became visible. The secret became known. The family will adapt. They always do. But they can never be as powerful as they were when nobody knew they existed. Knowledge is the ultimate power. And now, you know. This changes everything. If this opened your eyes, the next video goes even deeper. We reveal the specific names, dates, and documents that prove this connection. We show you the family tree. We trace the money. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Let's recap the 3 biggest takeaways. First, one family built an empire in finance and has controlled global money systems for over 2 centuries. Second, their power worked because it stayed hidden, protected by complexity and layers of institutions. Third, that invisibility is disappearing, and for the first time, real change is possible. This isn't a story to make you feel hopeless. It's a story to make you understand how power actually works. Once you understand the system, you can change it. That's the real revelation here. Here's what happens next. Hit that subscribe button. Not because we want subscribers, because you want to keep learning. The next video is even more shocking. We break down the actual documents. We name specific individuals. We show you the flow of money. We prove every claim. But here's the deeper opportunity. We've created a complete course on financial literacy and how hidden systems work. Link is in the description. This course teaches you what schools don't. It shows you how to protect yourself, how to think differently about money, how to become truly independent. Also, join our newsletter. Every week, we send exclusive research, documents, and analysis you won't find anywhere else. We share what we're investigating next. We build a community of people who are waking up. Finally, here's my question for you. If you could change one thing about the financial system, what would it be? Comment below. Let's build something together. Let's create the future we actually want, not the one that's been planned for us.